Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again Masters of War, Latin America, and U.S. aggression, United States aggression, from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years. It's a book by Claire Nieto. He is a scholar in Colombia. He is a Colombian scholar, and he has served as UN mission for Colombia, the head of UNESCO, the Colombian delegation, Yugoslavia. He's had all sorts of accolades. He is a extremely diligent and well-researched scholar, and he describes the United States, campaign of terror in Latin America. Their, campaign of terrorism in Latin America. It amounts to basically a terrorism campaign in Latin America, a murder campaign, a imprisonment campaign, a torture campaign by the U.S. government. I mean, that's just what it is. And, we don't have to beat around the bush to know exactly what they did. Yesterday, we talked about, basically certain concepts. We talked about, popularity. American popularity, was waning severely after the 1959 Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro coming in, the popularity of Eisenhower in the United States was going down. There were, horrible protests against Eisenhower and Nixon's visit. They were stoned and spat at and insulted. After that popularity decline, Dwight Eisenhower went around Latin America. He even was not even seen by the Japanese prime minister. And he went around, and the U.S. government, became butchers, like serious sadistic criminals. They reviewed the amount of happiness the masses were at the Cuban Revolution, and they decided to go down Latin America and lower the population. That is my assessment, is that they went around and murdered people for the sake of making less people to be popular and supportive of Castro. That was, basically what happened. They, murdered so many people, so many innocent Latin Americans were murdered by the U.S. government and their, mafia, nuclear armed gangsters. That's what I call them, nuclear armed gangsters. They were murdered, by, military dictatorships. They placed military dictatorships that had the trust for America. They trusted America, and America did not oversee that trust. They threw the trust away and, stole and raped the land, and, murdered the people, raped the people, tortured the people, and then they left. And that's what ended up happening. The U.S. government became sadistic and delusional and, looked at everyone and said that, if we're going to get, bad, ratings in Latin America, then we're going to murder more Latin American peoples. And that's the United States in general. They are racist, mafia, gangsters, murderous mafia, gangsters, and butchers that, do the same thing. So, it's important to understand these things because, when the U.S. government gets jealous and jealous about popularity, they, act in seriously murderous ways. And, that is not the way people should act. I mean, that is not the way that people should act. People should, be able to accept other people's popularity and different viewpoints about their people's success. One person like Castro trying to improve, one person like Fidel trying to improve all of the different social programs, the healthcare, all of the stuff for Latin America, for Cuba, and not, involved in exporting the revolution. Should be accepted. It should be accepted as the way to go. But instead it was, we're going to learn about how they, subverted Fidel and how they, mass murdered against Fidel's people and, waged war on the Cuban people. The racist American government, butchers waged war against the Cuban people throughout its history. And that is, the fact. So let's get started with some background. Again, the book link will be in the description section. Please download the book so that you can read the book. I recommend reading the books because he does, a great job in, describing all of what has happened in Latin America, and it's a great book. So we now turn to chapters 1 and 2, mare nostrum, mare colostrum, and the second chapter is Some Come, Some Go. We are discussing the terrorist, white murderous butcher, Franklin Roosevelt, whom yesterday during my presentation, I inadvertently didn't name His first name, correctly, I named it as Theodore when it was Franklin. And he is the 1933 to 1944 president who presided over Latin America during this time. He was, of course, a brutal racist. He was chastised for his pro-capitalist, racist policies of enslavement of the Latin American people and was involved in promoting Rafael Trujillo, the butcher of the Dominican Republic. Roosevelt endorsed this mass murder as friends with America. Roosevelt's policies were labeled as, by Mexican writer Jesus Herzog, as just a modification of verbiage of Theodore Roosevelt's big stick policy, which was called the open door, the good neighbor policy, or the open door policy. A large segment, as we discussed, was Fidel Castro. America, as a group of white enslaving butchers, waged a brutal assassination campaign against Fidel and murdered hundreds of Panamanians in an attempt on his life in which Fidel escaped unscathed. They also waged biological warfare against Cuba and spread diseases to Cuba to destroy the Cuban people's will to live. The racist whites of America also used chemical weapons against Cuba in a vicious campaign of terror, including napalm and other poisons. They tried murdering Fidel Castro through poisoning. Fidel was an excellent promoter of health and wellness of the Cuban people and was uniformly loved in Latin America. No Latin American country would part with Fidel's popularity, and major revolts were seen in countries which were becoming too friendly with the United States. Unlike Dwight Eisenhower, who was hated in Latin America and was stoned and spit at in Buenos Aries, Argentina, and was not even received by the Japanese prime minister when he was needing to visit due to violent popular demonstrations against his visit, Fidel was uniformly loved in the world. Washington forces its popularity through bribery and murder. The jealous, delusional whites of Washington became angry at the Cuban people and Castro for the lack of international popularity and conducted a murderous war to subdue this jealousy. Direct military bombing with napalm was carried out, as chemical warfare and biological warfare was also discussed previously. Castro's improvement of the economic situation, including making the sugar plantations nationalized and the textiles and oil to be controlled with their own government. The U.S. government thugs with nuclear weapons always try to steal money and oil, especially for the white capitalist success and frauds. Fidel was an enormous success for Cuba and was uniformly loved in the world despite Washington's brutal and murderous campaign of thuggery against him and his people. Nelson Mandela adored him and was endeared to him. As usual, the U.S. media frauds of the New York Times and Washington Post this deceitful anti-Cuban propaganda to paint the Cuban government as exporting revolution and became paranoid, delusional whites in their attempt to murder Fidel Castro. We again see Washington's history of mass murder in Latin America, its racist campaign against popular leaders for enslavement of the third world people, and their remarkable deception in what happened and what they did and continue to do against Latin America to maintain a state of subjugation of its fascist client, murderous state. So let's get started. Chapter 3. The name of the chapter is The Turbulent 1960s. The United States, the World, and Cuba's Challenge. John F. Kennedy's victory over in the November 1960 presidential election heralded a domestic rebirth and a favorable change in the tense international atmosphere. Kennedy's victory by a narrow margin of 118,000 votes out of a total of 68 million not only returned the Democratic Party to power after 8 years of Republican rule, but also ushered in a great generation shift in the White House. The administration of the beloved hero of the Second World War was one of the bland, leading the bland had ended. Gone were the goofy grin and the stack of Zane Grey westerns on the night table, forever playing golf or fishing, or otherwise treating the White House as a pleasant retirement home, as Time magazine put it. With the vigorous Kennedy team of the best and the brightest came the magic of a sophisticated, complex, intellectual, and elegant society with a progressive program called the New Frontier. Kennedy was the first Catholic and the youngest 10 years older than Fidel Castro, president in the United States history. He blew onto the national and international scene in the turbulent 1960s like a breath of hope. He was gay, charming, irreverent, good-looking, and far from diligent, said his Harvard professor, John Kenneth Galbraith, but he nevertheless graduated magna cum laude. Theodore Sorensen, one of his many biographers, noted, for the United States, the Kennedy and Johnson years were explosive. Society was divided by profound social conflicts, by the youth rebellion, by the struggle for civil rights, and by the war in Vietnam and the growing internal and international opposition to it. There was uncertainty among the people of the United States about the direction the country was taking. Young people questioned traditional values and codes and dogmas of an opulent, white, and puritanical America, ultimately dismissing them as banal and obsolete. The young people invented their own codes of conduct, showing out the traditional family unit, embracing a communal lifestyle and sexual freedom. Gays and lesbians demanded that their civil rights be respected. It was a decade of drugs, sex, meditation, war, anti-war activities, and emphasis on interior richness. The hippies with their own style of dress, their long hair, their beards, and their music. The Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Dylan, John Baez, and Rolling Stones, The Doors, and many more who evolved into the soundtrack of the counterculture became the emblem of a liberated youth opposed to violence, the Vietnam War, and the hypocrisy of the elders. Such slogans as "Make Love, Not War," Bob Dylan's protest against the masters of war, and John Lennon's song "Give Peace a Chance" became the chant for many of the anti-war demonstrations in San Francisco in November 1969. The 1960s in the United States were bursting with enormous creativity and breakthroughs. It was the time of a cultural revolution with new expressions and inventions in all arts. There was the emergence of avant-garde theater, the living theater, and the theater of the absurd. A new anti-literary movement of abstraction in literature, pop art, op art, abstract expressionism, experimental and underground films. The Christian churches were called on to change as well. Jim Heath, writer in the United States, discussed radical Protestant theologians who proclaimed that God is dead. He talked about a gang of Catholic priests, such as Daniel and Philip Berrigan, who led anti-war movements, and ministers less willing to take great risks to revive the social gossip and participated in demonstrations for human rights, in strikes, and in peace marches. Protestant and Catholics alike pledged to simplify and purify religion services to give them greater significance and make them more accessible to the worshipers. Together, let us explore the stars. When the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth for the first time in April 1961, the communist superpower inaugurated the space race, forever changing the dimensions of the world. 8 years later, American astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins landed on the moon. John Kennedy, who had pushed hard for the space program, was long dead when the first interplanetary communication reached Earth. It was Richard Nixon, his opponent, who would triumphantly receive the astronauts' message from the moon. In his victory speech of the State of the Union message and in front of the United Nations Assembly in 1961, Kennedy spoke of peaceful cooperation in space between the East and the West. He did not want space to become a new arena for the Cold War, and he extended a proposal to the Soviet Union. Together, let us explore the stars. But the Soviet Union did not accept, since its space program was far more advanced. Both nations continued their separate explorations of the moon, Venus and Mars, the United States with the Apollo program, and the Soviets with Vostok, Voskhod, and Soyuz craft. In 1972, however, missions to the moon were suspended. 30 years later, Americans still ask themselves why these flights were abandoned and why they went in the first place. In July 1975, the crews of Soyuz and Apollo first met in space during a joint rescue mission test. From space, they spoke to the world, delivering a message of peace. Upheavals in the communist world. The communist world experienced tremendous upheavals. with the liberating policies of Nikita Khrushchev, 1955 to 1964, and his denunciations of Stalin. At the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, CPSU, in 1956, he made public Stalin's criminal acts of repression and the corruption and distortions of Marxism tolerated by the Soviet state. Digging through 30 years of impenetrable secrecy, he brought to light the horrors of that regime, the crimes, the cult of personality, the abuse of power, and the corruption at the top levels of government in an orgy of privilege and luxury unthinkable in a supposedly egalitarian socialist society. With the abrupt departure of Uncle Joe from the communist pantheon and the subsequent de-Stalinization of the Soviet system, approved by the Soviet Communist Party in 1961, Khrushchev revived the doctrine of different roads to socialism of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and repudiated the centralization with which Stalin had tried to mold the communist world in the image of likeness of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Communist Party lost its infallibility in Moscow, its hegemony as the communist epicenter. In 1960, the break between the Soviet Union and China over ideologic differences, which make geopolitical conflicts, expanded the debate and deepened controversy in the communist world. Each accused the other of deviating from the fundamental principles of Marxism. The Soviets accused the Chinese of usurping the power of the Communist Party and terrorizing the true Chinese communists into silence, replacing Marxism and Maoist ideologies and working toward a social order that had nothing to do with Marxism. The Chinese in turn claimed the Soviet leaders were usurping the power with a palace revolution and had restored capitalism and become into a new bourgeois caste that oppressed and exploited the people. With this break grew a heretical and schismatic current that turned the communist world upside down. The parties sought their own practices, and new Marxist-Leninist movements emerged, and the parties emerged, some of them pro-China. The Soviet masses, disillusioned by the corruption of the Kremlin, wanted not more doctrine, but better goulash, said Khrushchev. John the 13th, Pontiff of the Poor. The Catholic Church was experiencing its own revolution in the 1960s. The ecumenical and reformist direction of the brief and dynamic papacy of John the 13th, 1958 to 1963, marked a liberating moment in the history of a church caught up in doctrinal questions and alienated from the realities and needs of the people. Our sacred obligation, noted the pontiff, is not only to guard the precious treasure of the faith, as if we had only to worry about the past, but to dedicate ourselves with joy and without fear to the task of giving this ancient and eternal doctrine a relevance that corresponds to the conditions of our time. After 100 years of stasis in the church, John the 13th called the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, whose purpose was to work actively so that there may be fulfilled the great mystery of that unity in accordance with the desires of Christ. In his encyclicals Mater et Magistra, 1961, and Pacena in Terra, 1963, the Pope declared that the Church should address the world's problems and place economic and social developments in the moral realm of conformity to the dignity of man, an enormous value which is the life of human beings. At the 1968 conclave of the Latin American Episcopal Council, Consejo Episcopal Latin Americano, CELAM, held in Medellin, Colombia, the most important ecclesiastic event of the decade, the bishops met to study the Second Vatican Council's recommendations with respect to the continental realities, concluding that the Church's duty was to fight against injustice and institutionalized violence, which was deemed sinful. The clerics broke with the old rules that govern the Latin American Church. The Vatican reoriented its attention toward the plight of the poor, signaling, like Cuban Revolution, the volatility of social and economic injustice and the misery of the masses. Thus, in 1968, Latin America, a continent where the vast majority of people are poor and Catholic, saw the emergence of liberation theology. Its origin was ecumenical, the result of the work of Catholic and Protestant theologians who sought the unions of faith with Christian practice of the credo and justice. They questioned the conduct of the rich nations toward the poor ones and the growing gap in the Latin American societies between the small minority privileged families not eager to lose their advantages and the vast number of destitutes. They stressed the need to make deep structural change to correct such injustices. After Pope John XIII's death, opposition arose throughout the continent from the hierarchies within the Vatican and the Catholic Church against the liberation theologians. They were seen as dipping dangerously into the stream of Marxism, and their analysis of social reality was considered to be drawn along its doctrine. The radicalized clergy had created Christian grassroots communities in several countries to work for the poor campesinos and rural marginalized sectors and raise consciousness of the rights of the poor, to help organize their movements and to support their struggles. Some joined insurgent groups. The unstable international arena. The scene in the international arena was changing. The geopolitical power struggle between Washington and Moscow created sharp tensions and divisions of the world into two antagonistic blocs led by the superpowers. The emergence of new axes of power, Western Europe, China, Japan, and the non-aligned movements, weakened the superpowers. At the beginning of the 1960s, the Third World was strengthened by the creation of two important political organizations, the Non-Aligned Movement of 1961 and the Organization of African Unity of 1963. The objectives of the Non-Aligned Movement were anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-neocolonialist, and its supporters of the National Liberation Movement. The objective of the Organization of African Unity was to give political cohesion and unity to the African nations and to establish a power bloc against the rest of the world. With the entry into the United Nations of 27 newly independent and non-aligned African countries, the balance of power in the organization changed. The United States could no longer count on easy majorities. The political weight of Latin America, on which it had always relied, disappeared in the face of developing power of the Afro-Asian bloc. The United States, Soviet Union, China, and Israel sought to extend their influence in these newly independent countries, offering economic and technical assistance to aid in their development. Similarly, Cuba built closer ties to them, sending advisors in various fields, educating thousands of students at no charge in its schools, and supporting African liberation with weapons, military advisors, and training for their combatants. Tensions between the giants. And the tensions between Washington and Moscow increased after a U-2 plane was shot down over Sverdlovsk, Russia in 1959. Khrushchev proved that Eisenhower had lied to him about the plane's mission. It had not been on a meteorological flight, as the president maintained, but had engaged in espionage. In May 1960, at a summit meeting in Paris, in which the United States, Great Britain, and France participated, Khrushchev accused Eisenhower of an act of provocation, walked out of the conference, and withdrew an invitation to Eisenhower to visit Moscow. After this, confrontations with mutual distrust clouded the international atmosphere once again. Khrushchev had declared his policy of peaceful coexistence among states before John F. Kennedy was elected president. He proposed that relations between communist and capitalist countries should be respectful, and he admonished the United States for trying to remake the world in its own image. Kennedy's election victory in November 1960 promised to relieve some of the existing tensions. During his presidential campaign, Kennedy questioned the policies that rejected communism out of hand, and he disapproved of the confrontation of the Soviet Union maintained by Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. In his inaugural address, Kennedy stressed that the enemies were not the communists, but those who became adversaries. In a letter to Khrushchev, he noted, "What your government believes is its own business. What it does in the world is the world's business." Tensions grew in August 1961 when the Soviets erected the Berlin Wall, a barrier both concrete and symbolic of East-West confrontation. Kennedy was open to dialogue with the Soviet Union. He made this clear when he said, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." He maintained that their difference did not impede dialogue or collaboration essential to prevailing a Third World War. Between April 1961 and December 1962, the two leaders exchanged some 40 messages in which they dealt with their bilateral relations and international matters of mutual interest, disarmament, nuclear testing, and sensitive situations in Berlin, Cuba, Southeast Asia, Laos, and Vietnam, and the situation in the Congo, Leopoldville, whose war was a burning topic at the United Nations. In their first and only meeting held in Vienna in June 1961, 2 months after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the two leaders held a tough and open dialogue, but came to no agreement. For Kennedy, the experience was enormously frustrating. In London, on his way back to Washington, he described the meeting as somber, but immediately useful. The most dangerous crisis during Kennedy and Khrushchev's time in office arose from the installation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba in October 1962. It brought the world to the brink of a nuclear conflagration. Kennedy demanded their withdrawal and Khrushchev acceded. Thereafter, the two leaders established a direct telephone line between Washington and Moscow, the red phone, to avoid errors in situations that it would endanger world peace. The balance of terror. By 1961, the nuclear arms race was speeding up. The Soviet Union exploded its first hydrogen bomb at 50 megatons, the most powerful to date, and France tested its first atomic bomb. The destructive potential of the superpowers reached a peak with intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads. Now they could destroy not only each other, but also the entire world. For the United States, the balance of terror thwarted aggressive action and ensured world peace. Kennedy was uneasy about the entry of new countries into the nuclear club, since it would increase the risk of conflagration. In 1962, the United States and Great Britain renewed nuclear testing, striking a hard blow for the slow and difficult negotiations on general and complete disarmament. 2 years later, China tested its first atomic bomb, and by 1967 had exploded its first hydrogen bomb. The net result of Kennedy and Khrushchev's peace efforts were positive. In 1963, the United States and Soviet Union signed in Moscow the first international limited test ban treaty prohibiting tests in the atmosphere and underwater. Great Britain signed on as well. The great powers which promoted the atmosphere with 336 tests in 13 years were forced to carry out their tests exclusively underground. The signing of this important treaty was not the culmination of a process, but the first step toward general and complete disarmament. According to Kennedy, discussion on this point had been stalled in the United Nations General Assembly since 1946. The sticking point had been the United States' demand for inspection and international control of disarmament, and the Soviet Union's refusal to accept these terms. The Cuban Revolution breaks out. When Kennedy assumed the presidency, the Cuban Revolution already posed a serious problem for his country. Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union was growing stronger and sooner after. Fidel announced the socialist nature of the revolution. The existence of the first socialist state in the hemisphere means a geopolitical change with enormous negative consequences for the United States, with Cuba becoming a factor in the East-West confrontation. Kennedy was forced to reformulate his policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean so as to confront the influence of the Cuban Revolution. Fidel had virtually expelled the United States from the island and expropriated and nationalized all American enterprises and large land holdings, and Kennedy worried such procedures might also be implemented in other countries. Fidel's vigorous anti-imperialist and nationalist discourse encouraged the people's armed struggle in defense of their rights against the dictatorship and oligarchies that exploited them and the domination exercised by the world's superpower on Latin America. Armed pro-Castro groups began to arise almost immediately. In effect, the Cuban Revolution was giving a new dynamic to social protest and hope to the peoples burdened with the endemic situation of poverty, social injustice, exploitation, and false promises. Faced with the fact that there were few opportunities along democratic lines, armed struggle seemed to be the only possible way to achieve change. The Kennedy era. When Kennedy settled into the White House, the international atmosphere was charged with growing anti-Americanism in different parts of the world. The prestige of the United States was tainted by the mistakes and fiascos of the last years of the Eisenhower administration. In the United Nations, the principal forum where Cuba and the United States aired their differences, the Cuban government constantly denounced American acts of aggression against its country, cultivating an anti-Yankee and anti-imperialist discourse. Never before had the United States suffered such public affront from a nation in its own sphere. Within the United States, the struggle for civil rights was growing hotter and protests raging throughout the nation. Its main leader, Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated in 1968, advocated a peaceful struggle, while the Black Power, Black Muslim, and Black Panther movements declared their right to respond in self-defense to violence with violence. In the hot summer of 1963, Kennedy witnessed the most impressive racial protest ever seen in Washington. As many as 200,000 blacks, along with thousands of whites, marched silently through the streets of the Capitol. At the Lincoln Memorial, King delivered his now famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a desert state, sweltering with heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Also in 1963, the United States saw the first massive student protest demanding the cessation of U.S. interventions in Asia. Between 1961 and 1963, Kennedy had sent 17,000 soldiers to Vietnam, the first combat troops. Vigorous youth movements flooded the streets and university campuses demanding hands-off Vietnam. The Hemispheric Alliance. Kennedy was severely critical of Eisenhower's policies, which he considered terribly misguided. Latin America had been of secondary importance to Eisenhower's foreign policy. His priorities were military strategy and security, openly supporting dictatorships. Such support, stated Kennedy, had propped up one of the most bloody and repressive dictatorships in the long history of Latin American repression, referring to Batista's regime in Cuba. Our action too often gave the impression that this country was more interested in making money from the Cuban people than in helping them build a strong and diversified economy of their own, he noted. He criticized Eisenhower for not having used the United States' enormous influence to persuade Batista to hold free elections and to let the Cuban people pick his successor instead of letting Castro seize it in what almost amounted to a palace revolution. And he added the Soviet ambassador became the second most powerful man in Cuba. He charged Eisenhower with being responsible for the triumph of the revolution, which he called a disaster. And he pointed out that the enemy was now a mere 90 miles from the United States coast. As a Soviet satellite, it will do anything to hasten our fall, and it will attempt to spread its revolution throughout Latin America. For Kennedy, Latin America was the most critical area of the world. He understood that popular solidarity with the Cuban Revolution signified something more than youthful idealism or revolts instigated by the communists. He saw Latin America sitting on a volcano of hunger, sickness, and social injustice, and aspirations repressed for decades. Kennedy spoke of strengthening the democracies and supporting the cause of freedom in Latin America. He wanted to differentiate his policies from Eisenhower, seeing that the hemispheric relations should be conducted through the OAS and the Cuba question should be handled as continental policy. He was against unilateral action since they awakened strong reactions against Yankee imperialism. No continent was more constantly in the president's mind or had a warmer appreciation of his efforts than Latin America, wrote Kennedy's biographer Theodore Roosevelt. During his campaign and his inaugural address, Kennedy proposed that hemispheric relations should represent an alliance for progress. He spoke of quiet social and economic revolutions. The social content of Kennedy's politics ran as deep as President Franklin Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy. It was a program of social and economic development which sought to improve the living conditions of the people of Latin America. The Alliance for Progress was the first plan in Latin America proposed by the United States in which social economic things were of equal importance. It was a plan for development within the capitalist framework, an alternative to Cuba's socialist policy. The United States offered $20 billion in aid over a 10-year period. Some dubbed the Alliance for Castro plan, believing that the United States government change in favor of the continent was a result of Fidel's spreading of unrest throughout the continent. The Alliance's first priority was to raise the people's standard of living by providing employment, housing, land, healthcare, and education to all. Our unfulfilled task is to demonstrate that man's unsatisfied aspiration for economic progress and social justice can best be achieved by free men working within the framework of democratic institutions, said Kennedy. He conceived of the Alliance as a plan for cooperation. Each country should set aside resources to improve the living conditions for its people and to realize the structural reforms necessary to correct existing inequalities. The alliance was received with enormous enthusiasm and hope throughout the region. At the opening of the OAS conference in the resort city of Punta del Este, Uruguay, in August 1961, where the proposal for the alliance was adopted over Cuba's vote against, Uruguay's President Victor Hato exclaimed that finally a hope for our millions of hungry existed. Carlos de Santa Maria, former Chancellor of Colombia and later President of the Inter-American Committee for the Alliance, CIAP, called it a program with a human face. Kennedy considered the alliance the only alternative that could produce change without violence. The continent's peoples and democratic sectors recognized Kennedy as an ally, a friend, and a hope for change. On his visit to Colombia in 1961, where he and his wife Jacqueline were the guests of President Alberto Lleras, the people gave them a tumultuous welcome. Lleras told Kennedy that this popular enthusiasm was because the people believed him to be on their side and against the oligarchies. Kennedy's defense strategy in response to the Cuban Revolution gave a completely new direction to the hemispheric defense policy to the Cold War. Its focus was counterinsurgency under the Military Mutual Assistance Pacts, MAP, bilateral agreements in force since the 1940s for hemispheric defense. The United States gave weapons and sent its special forces to train national armies in martial techniques for combating guerrilla movements, controlling public order, and vanquishing the enemy within. The new tasks assigned to the armies, which are police functions, were adapted by all governments in violation of the constitutional dispositions that assigned the armies exclusively to the defense of national sovereignty. Kennedy lent more economic resources and leadership imagination to the counterinsurgency strategy than any general in the Pentagon, and even that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara himself. Sorensen writes that the president read Mao Zedong's and Che Guevara's texts on guerrilla warfare, sources of inspiration to the Third World revolutionaries, and recommended them to certain military officers since he was convinced that the Pentagon's own military manuals were uninspiring and inadequate. To train the Latin American officers in counterinsurgency techniques, the Pentagon beefed up the War College for Jungle Warfare, the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and the Special Forces Group at Fort Guadalcanal Zone. Between 1950s and 1975, more than 70,000 officers from countries in conflict graduated from the schools. In 1962, Kennedy created the Inter-American Police Academy at Fort Davis in Panama to train continental police officers in keeping the public order and in espionage and counter-espionage techniques. Between 1962 and 1963, 600 officers from 15 countries were trained at this school. The training area was not the only in military and security matters. It also included instruction in anti-communist ideology and the strengthening of democratic principles. The objection was to prepare a military elite capable of assuming leadership in countries where the social and student protests deemed communist or communist leaning had the potential to explode into revolutionary situations. Secretary of Defense McNamara explained to Congress that in 1962, probably the greatest return in our military assistance investment comes from training selective officers and key specialists at our military schools and training centers in the United States and overseas. They are coming leaders. They're the coming leaders, the men that will have the know-how and impart it to their own forces. He signaled the importance to the United States, beyond praise to us, to make friends of such men who will have firsthand knowledge of how things are done and how Americans think. Kennedy's counterinsurgency strategy at the national security doctrine and the national security doctrine of Brazilian generals went hand in hand. Both were based on the concept of security, and developments were anti-communist and gave a preeminent place to the military. According to Alfredo Vasquez Cartasoza, the former Colombian chancellor, such doctrines had vast implications for the future national, political, and social development, and were a source of inspiration to the military officers on the continent. What's happening in Cuba? The conflict in the United States over the Cuban Revolution was a key campaign issue in 1960. Crucial in the televised debate of the candidates, Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Kennedy severely criticized the policies of the Republican administration, charging that for the first time that the United States history, an enemy stands poised at the throat of the United States. He also slammed Fidel Castro on September 2nd, 1960, saying he should be condemned for being the source of the maximum danger, adding that the major task of his government would be to contain this revolution and communism in Latin America. Arthur Schlesinger, one of the president's advisors, noted that Kennedy was the first president not to hold the misconception that all Latin American agitation is communist inspired, that every anti-American voice is the voice of Moscow, and that most citizens of Latin America share our dedication to an anti-communist crusade to save what we call free enterprise. Sorensen indicated that in 1963, Kennedy recognized that the great dangers on the continent bore no relation to Cuba or to communist activity in these countries, but Kennedy maintained that communist infiltration and subversion must be held in check in order for the alliance to succeed. Without sharing Dulles' aggravated anti-communist stance, Kennedy continued the Cold War policy of containment of international communism. He put the Cuban problem in context. He considered Cuba a threat to security in the United States and Latin America. His policies opposing the revolution were more aggressive than Eisenhower's. Kennedy was determined to crush the revolution, to get rid of Fidel Castro. He cut off entirely the quota of Cuban sugar, the resource on which the island's economy depended. He extended the economic and commercial embargo and pressured allied and friendly countries under the threat of reprisals and sanctions to join this embargo and cut diplomatic and commercial relations with the island. By 1964, a year after Kennedy's assassination, all the Latin American countries except Mexico had severed relations with Havana. The CIA intensified its clandestine aircraft flights from Florida, operations mostly carried out with anti-Castro exiles living in the United States to bombard sugar processing plants and oil refineries. It also stepped up efforts to infiltrate agents who would carry out acts of terrorism and sabotage. But their primary objective was to assassinate Fidel and members of the Cuban leadership. Most of these attempts failed. Cuban security forces captured, imprisoned, and exposed the CIA agents to prove the United States of aggression against Cuba. Kennedy inherited from Eisenhower secret preparations for invading Cuba with a mercenary brigade of anti-Castro exiles. In spite of his profound reservations, not for ethical reasons, but for fear of failure, Kennedy continued to further this adventurous plan. It was already common knowledge that the United States was responsible for the CIA covert enterprise. Kennedy knew that its failure could strike a severe blow to the United States' prestige, as well as to his government and to his chances for re-election. A month after his inauguration in February 1961, Kennedy sent Senator George McGovern and Arthur Schlesinger to Latin America to sound out the political and economic power centers and public opinion about the revolution and Fidel. What they learned amounted to a picture of unqualified popular support for the revolution, Fidel and Che, and fear on the part of governments which perceived the revolution as a potential danger. Important democratic leaders expressed themselves in favor of eliminating Castro, calling him the main threat to their democracies. In fact, Raul Hava de la Torre, leader of the American Revolutionary People's Alliance, APRA, Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana, the main Peruvian Popular Party, and president of Bolivia, Victor Paz Estensora, ex-president of Guatemala, Juan Jose Aravalos, and president of Venezuela, Romulo Betancourt, all criticized the revolution. Betancourt opined that Latin America would unite against Castro, just as it had when the OAS discovered that Trujillo had attempted to kill him. The Bay of Pigs. Sorensen wrote that Kennedy inherited not only the plan to invade Cuba, but also the planners and most disquieting, the Brigade of Cuban Exiles, an armed force under another flag, highly trained at secret bases in Guatemala, with the sole mission of invading the island. He commented that when the CIA informed Kennedy of these plans before his inauguration, he was surprised at its magnitude and audacity. From the start, he harbored profound doubts, which were shared by some members of Congress and the Pentagon. CIA reports were contradictory. Some claimed that anti-Castro forces could count on massive support from the Cuban people, while others warned that the time was against them because Castro was growing stronger by the day. Kennedy did not dare to suspend the clandestine operation. Its preparations were moving ahead at full speed. Since the operation became public almost immediately, Chancellor Raul Roa denounced it at the United Nations and the OAS. Cuban Chancellor, the New York Times and other influential newspapers reported on the preparations and the clandestine bases in Guatemala, where United States military advisors were training a brigade of more than 1,000 anti-Castro mercenaries. They also revealed that Somoza provided Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua as a base from which the invasion could set out, along with other training centers in Costa Rica and on the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico. In addition, the anti-Castro forces recruited by the CIA in Miami were telling everything they knew everywhere they went. The public dissemination of information about the United States' plans to invade Cuba was embarrassing for Kennedy. He had to define the situation quickly, since problems were mounting. The Guatemalan bases were infested with poisonous snakes and boiling with tension between gringos and Cuban trainees. They were fed up with the bad food, the inadequate medical services, and the second-class treatment their patrons allotted to them. Some gave up and left. By January 1961, they were on the point of shooting at each other. The Guatemalan army, too, no longer able to tolerate the discriminatory treatment of the subordinate role assigned it by the gringos and mercenaries, confronted them. The Cuban brigade was becoming unmanageable, not only because of the high tension of the bases, but also because of the relief its members sought. The off-pace left it Mexico in droves, in search of prostitutes, sometimes going as far away as Mexico. Guatemalan President General Miguel Ydigorez Fuentes informed Washington about this dangerous situation and asked for help in resolving it. He had set up a whorehouse near the base, stocked not with young Guatemalans, but with Salvadoran and Costa Rican women. With so much pillow talk going on, he was afraid that secrets embarrassing to his government and to the United States would be revealed. The CIA refused to allow the contributors' money to be used, at least openly, to satisfy the lusts of the brigade. On March 11, 1961, at a meeting at the White House that Schlesinger termed intimidating, the Secretaries of State and Defense, 3 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff dressed in uniform and wearing decorations, and numerous assistants and hawkish aides pressed the president to launch the invasion. One of those present warned, "Don't forget that we have a disposal problem. We have to take these men out of Guatemala. We will have to transfer them to the United States, and we cannot have them wandering around the country telling everyone what they have been doing. They insisted that if the United States mobilized these troops, they could refuse to surrender their arms, and if the United States dispersed them, they would tell all of Latin America that the United States had turned its back on them and would provoke other communist takeovers in the hemisphere. In a press conference a week before the invasion, Kennedy said that the United States troops would not take part in any action against Cuba. He wanted to indicate to the public that the coming invasion, which was already common knowledge, was an affair among Cubans. For Kennedy, the situation was irreversible. He reluctantly agreed to send anti-Castro forces to the destination they had chosen. The 506th Brigade was composed of 1,500 magnificently trained men with uniforms, weapons, tanks, and planes, all provided by the United States, with 6 infantry battalions, 1 company of paratroopers, 62 pilots, and a detachment of frogmen. On April 15, 1961, 2 days before the invasion, B-26 bombers blasted Havana. On April 15, 1961, 2 days before the invasion, B-26 bombers blasted Havana, San Antonio de los Banos, Santiago de Cuba, and other cities, leaving many casualties and destroying a large part of the Cuban Air Force. The United States General Assembly, meeting in New York, immediately had to address the Cuban denunciation of this new and serious act of aggression by the United States. Washington maintained that the bombardment was an act against Castro's government by deserters from the Cuban Air Force, but the Cuban government immediately demonstrated that it had been a clumsy CIA operation. Cuban Chancellor Raul Roa declared before the assembly that the type of aircraft used did not exist in Cuba, and planes were painted with false insignias and had taken off from Florida. Adlai Stevenson, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, vigorously defended the story of deserters that the State Department had given him, but he had been fooled and set up to defend a lie before the international community. For a man so respected and admired all over the world for his integrity and intellectual honesty, this was an intolerable situation. 4 days later, the defeat of the United States at the Bay of Pigs shamed him deeply. Stevenson had opposed this adventure from the start and had repeatedly said as much to the president. At the funeral for the victims of these bombings shortly before the invasion, Fidel declared that the Cuban Revolution was indeed a socialist one. On April 17, 1961, the invasion brigade set off from Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua, sailing out in 7 ships escorted by the United States fleet. It disembarked at dawn in the Bay of Pigs, known as Guaran Beach, to Cubans, 125 miles from Havana. After 72 hours of intense combat, the Cuban army had sunk 4 ships, shot down 5 planes, killed 89 invaders, at a cost of 157 deaths among the defenders, and taken 1,200 prisoners. The decimated flotilla returned to its port. The invasion was Cuba's great triumph and a big fiasco for Kennedy. He admitted his defeat. The captives left to their fate had to face the tribunals of the revolution. Several Batista-era war criminals recognized by the people when they were shown on television were indicted, some put before a firing squad and others condemned to long prison terms. There was a great deal of bitterness and resentment among the prisoners, many of whom claimed that the United States had tricked them and openly regretted their involvement in this dangerous enterprise. Arthur Schlesinger wrote, "Fidel Castro turned out to be far more formidable foe and in command of a better organized regime than anyone had supposed. His patrol spotted the invasion as almost the first possible moment. His planes reacted with speed and vigor. His police eliminated any chance of sabotage or rebellion behind the lines. His soldiers stayed loyal and fought hard." Fidel demanded that the United States pay reparations in kind, 500 tractors, for the damage done, and promised to return more than 1,000 prisoners. After long negotiations, according to the United States records, Fidel received $53 million worth of food and medicine donated by the private sector, though Fidel claimed that the donations amounted to no more than $43 million. Cuba returned many of the prisoners to Miami in December 1962 so they could enjoy the Christmas holiday with their families. They were welcomed as heroes of Guaran. The rest remained in Cuban prisons. The United States' defeat at the Bay of Pigs was not only a great military victory for Cuba, but a political triumph as well. For Kennedy, it was not only a great national and international fiasco, but an embarrassing situation before the nation. It became clear that the president had lied to the people. Nevertheless, public opinion solidly supported him. A month later, according to a Gallup poll, his approval rating was 82%. Reaction against the United States was vigorous in several parts of the world. Countless mass demonstrations in support of Cuba and in condemnation of Yankee imperialism occurred in many cities, including New York City, Rome, Milan, Moscow, Montevideo, Warsaw, Bucharest, Buenos Aires, Bonn, Berlin, Reykjavik, Bogota, Caracas, Tokyo, Guayaquil, and Guatemala City. In several capitals, the American embassies were stoned. Their flags were burned in the streets. Throughout Latin America, Congress, student movements, politicians, and intellectuals, and the press condemned this aggressive behavior, alleging that the United States had violated standards of international law and the charters of both the UN and the OAS. Kennedy took responsibility for the failure, recalling the old adage, "Victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." Later, he regretted having persuaded the New York Times to drop its denunciations of the preparations for the invasion of Cuba, as he had done by citing reasons of national security. If the newspaper had persisted, he believed, he might have been dissuaded. Kennedy held the CIA responsible for the fiasco, and heads began to roll, leading to the fall of the CIA director, Allen Dulles, and of the deputy director of planning, Richard Bissell, considered one of the agency's best minds. Kennedy named John McCone as the new director, 1961 to 1965, and Richard Helms as deputy director, 1962 to 1965. Some considered the departure of the old guard, the Torquemadas of the Cold War, anti-communism, the end of CIA's golden age for others. It marked the end of the agency's most sinister period, characterized by murders, assassination attempts on foreign leaders, and coups d'etats in other countries. Every year on April 19th, the Cuban government commemorates its victory in Playa Grande, the Bay of Pigs, the first defeat of imperialism in America. On the same day in Miami, Cuban Americans and veterans of the invasion gather at the monument they erected to honor the martyrs of Giron, to celebrate their heroic deed. They bring floral offerings and make speeches in which resentments are recited, rosaries of broken promises, occasions of error recounted, imperfect understandings, instances in which superimposition of Washington's abstractions on Miami possibilities may or may not have been, in a word Washington came to prefer during the 1980s, flawed, wrote Joan Didion in her new book, Miami. She recalled the melancholic words of Reagan's United Nations ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick at the anniversary event in 1986. How different the world would have been if the brigade had triumphed. Getting rid of Fidel. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy toughened his policies concerning Cuba, extended the economic embargo, and became more determined to overthrow Fidel. CIA Director William Colby, 1973 to 1976, claimed that Kennedy had ordered the CIA to use its covert action capabilities to get rid of the Cuban leader with all the ambiguity that phrase implies. The CIA set up Operations Mongoose, the most expansive and costly operation at the time, run by Attorney General Robert Kennedy and General Maxwell Taylor. No operation had been as carefully tended to, more secretive, of higher priority, or treated with a greater sense of urgency. The Kennedys wanted quick results. The special group created to supervise the operation scheduled Fidel's downfall for October 1962, believing that the operation could count on Cuban popular support. Its planner could not have been more wrong. The CIA proceeded to recruit agents to infiltrate into Cuba. Most of these were Cuban exiles. It also recruited foreign businessmen and diplomats. The prime objective was to assassinate Fidel. The Senate commission, chaired by Frank Church, which investigated the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, confirmed several of the attempts to assassinate Fidel, some of which were coordinated with the mafia. Dons Meyer Lenski, John Rosell, Sam Giancana, and Santo Traficante, whose businesses in the island were cut off by the revolution. According to a CIA agent, Robert Kennedy was furious when he learned of such agreements, since they could derail the case he was building against Giancana and Roselli. Several agents testified that the Kennedys were keenly aware of their plans to assassinate the Cuban leader. The CIA installed an enormous espionage apparatus at the University of Miami, the biggest base ever created on United States territory, codenamed GM Wave. It had an annual budget of $100 million, 600 employees, and more than 1,000 agents. It was equipped with It was equipped with small boats, motherships disguised as merchant ships, planes from the CIA Front Southern Air Transport, a huge arsenal, and safe houses and buildings. Between January and August 1961, it carried out 5,070. Between January and August 1961, it carried out 5,780 acts of sabotage and terrorism against Cuba, including attempts on Fidel's life with the cooperation of the mafia. So the mafia was involved in assassinating Fidel. The U.S. government used the mafia against Fidel Castro. The OAS, the colonial ministry. Washington sought judicial formalities in continental support for the development of its policies regarding Cuba at the OAS, where it could count on easy majorities. As Eisenhower did, Kennedy relied on unconditional solidarity from the Central American and Caribbean dictatorship and from most democratic governments. But in the case of Cuba, he failed to get the backing of the most influential nations. Washington made active diplomatic efforts to isolate Cuba from the rest of the continent and to expel it from the inter-American system. The United States succeeded in getting Peru to call the 18th consultative meeting of the OAS under Article 6 of the Treaty of Rio, which was invoked only in cases of armed aggression. The majority of the OAS members supported the move. Few abstained. Mexico voted against it, arguing that Cuba had not committed any acts of armed aggression or territorial violations, and that it was not threatening the independence of any member nation. Thus, the convocation of this meeting under the Treaty of Rio lacked the necessary legal basis. In January 1962, the 8th consultative meeting held in Punta del Este, Uruguay, met to consider the threats to peace and political independence of American states that might result from the intervention of extracontinental powers and the incompatibility of the inter-American system with all forms of totalitarianism. This was the argument used to expel Cuba. The Kennedy team obtained the necessary majority by buying Haiti's vote for $43 million. Haiti had indicated that it would abstain. Cuba was suspended, expelled from the OAS and the inter-American system. In addition, the meeting decreed a collective break with the Cuban government. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Ecuador, and Bolivia abstained, allegedly on legal grounds, and did not sever relations with Cuba as directed. Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Mexico also abstained from the resolution and decreed a suspension of commerce with Cuba. Between 1962 and 1963, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Uruguay broke off relations with Cuba after they had fallen under military dictatorships. The meeting represented another lamentable episode in the history of the regional organization, which always bowed to Washington's dictates. This time it supported Washington in spite of the fact that nothing in the OAS Charter allowed for the expulsion or suspension of one of its member nations. The arguments for the incompatibility of the inter-American system with any form of totalitarianism and for the defense of representative democracy were unsustainable, since the majority of the organization's member at this time were dictatorships that had never been challenged by the defenders of democracy. Fidel responded to the Punta del Este Declaration with the Second Havana Declaration, which was approved as the first by a massive concentration of people in the Plaza de la Revolution. The declaration accused the United States and the Latin American oligarchies of being responsible for the misery of their people. What united and incited them against Cuba, he said, was fear not of the Cuban Revolution, but of a Latin American revolution in which workers, campesinos, students, intellectuals, and progressive sectors might take power by means of revolution among the oppressed and hungry people and exploited by the Yankee monopolies and of reactionary oligarchies in America. To the accusations that Cuba was exporting its revolution, Fidel responded that revolutions were not exported, but made by the people. He also charged that the United States, along with the reactionary oligarchies, was creating an apparatus to repress the struggles of the people with blood and fire. He further alleged that the Inter-American Joint Defense Board, the United States military mission on the continent, its schools in the Panama Canal Zone, and the CIA were all training armies in this subtlest form of assassination and turning them into tools for the United States' interests. He exhorted the people to rebel against their oppressors. He asserted that Cuba had set the example. The duty of every revolutionary is to make revolution. He concluded with the slogan, Patricio a muerte venceremos, motherland of death, we shall win, amid thunderous applause and shouts of the people in defense of their revolution and in support of Fidel. The October crisis. In September 1962, the United States administration and Congress, citing the Monroe Doctrine, unleashed a tenacious and belligerent campaign against Cuba. At a meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of the Armed Services Committee with administration officials on September 17th, the meeting that lasted 5 hours and a standing room only, it was agreed that direct action should be taken against Cuba. 3 days later, the Senate unanimously passed a resolution recommending that all means, including the use of force, should be used to prevent Cuba from extending its subversive activities to any part of the hemisphere. 6 days later, the House of Representatives passed a similar bill by a vote of 384 to 7. The same September, Kennedy ordered a close watch by air, by sea, and on land of the island. He intensified surveillance flights. 5 U-2 airplanes set off on espionage flights, but bad weather kept them from taking aerial photographs. On September 16th, the CIA report on the latest Soviet military activities in Cuba stated that the Soviet Union was building 8 launching pads for surface-to-air missiles and would eventually build 24 more. 3 days later, the CIA reported that the agency did not believe that the Soviet Union intended to place nuclear weapons in Cuba, though to do so would be good military strategy because of the immense risk it would be presenting. By then, the 30 Soviet R-12 missiles had arrived in Cuba and more were on the way. Washington was alarmed by a report from the Soviet press agency TASS, dated September 11th, to the effect that the Soviet Union would respond to an attack on Cuba and that such an attack would be tantamount to a declaration of nuclear war. Presidential advisor Theodore Sorensen noted that this announcement stirred up a number of inquiries, for at the given moment an attack here could be retaliated there. That here and there described on a world map on which the two superpowers had sensitive objectives dispersed over several continents. That what Washington feared most was the act of retaliation against Berlin. In the transcript of recordings made at the Oval Office during the crisis, this was the most resonant and constant concern. In October, the CIA informed Kennedy that more than 100 ships off the Soviet Union and communist bloc nations were arriving and unloading at Cuban ports. The agency suspected that the cargo consisted of military materials. However, it was not until October 14th that the CIA's aerial photographs detected the presence of Soviet missiles in San Cristobal in the province of Pinar del Rio. The president demanded better proof and more photographs sufficiently enlarged for the necessary details to be clearly visible. When he confirmed the presence of these missiles, he called on top-secret meeting with the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, including the Secretaries of State and Defense, the director of the CIA, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and the United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. EXCOM's meetings were held in strict secrecy. Public awareness of the presence of nuclear weapons 90 miles from the United States would create panic both domestically and internationally. On October 18th, a date set long before the crisis, Soviet Chancellor Andrei Gromyko met with President Kennedy, unaware of that Kennedy knew of the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. Gromyko assured him that the Soviet military aid to the island solely consisted of defensive weapons. The Soviet troops, he claimed, were there only to train Cubans. The missiles were not mentioned. Kennedy held his tongue, but he was tremendously irritated by Gromyko's hypocrisy. As they spoke, Soviet ships were sailing toward Cuba carrying 42 nuclear missiles, each more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, that posed a definite threat to the security of the United States. This was the first time the Soviet Union had installed nuclear weapons outside its own territory. XCOM considered a number of options: massive invasion, naval blockade, surgical strikes on the launching complexes, though such an attack would run the risk of killing many Cubans and Soviets, pressuring Khrushchev to remove the weapons, proposing a summit meeting, offering to remove United States missiles in Turkey and Italy in exchange for the removal of the ones in Cuba, sending secret messages to Castro in an effort to separate him from the Soviet Union, declaring a state of emergency, asking Congress to declare war on Cuba, calling for United Nations and OAS inspection commissions, managing the crisis through secret diplomacy or doing nothing. The Pentagon advisors suggested inaction, reminding Kennedy that the United States had long been within the reach of Soviet missiles and that Khrushchev lived with American missiles on his borders. They counseled the presidents to deal with the situation calmly, to keep Khrushchev from escalating the tension. Some XCOM members were in favor of an air attack. Others supported an invasion. 20 years later, Robert McNamara remembered that at the moment they were unaware of the presence of Soviet troops in Cuba, and that an invasion or air attack would have led to a terrible massacre. The Cubans calculated that it would have cost the lives of 100,000 Cubans and Soviets. Kennedy knew that confrontation with the Soviet Union would have unforeseeable consequences, including the danger of nuclear conflagration. XCOM worked around the check for days, calculating the risks of retaliation by Moscow. If the United States were to take action against Cuba and the NATO allies' response, there were to be Soviet retaliation against Berlin. It could not allow the Europeans to believe that the United States would put their security at risk in order to protect its interests in the Caribbean, a region foreign to them. Robert Kennedy was against an attack on Cuba. He thought it would be a Pearl Harbor in reverse, and it would blacken the name of the United States in the pages of history. He added that an attack by a great power on a small neighbor would affect Latin America and produce new Castros, and that Cuban people would not forgive the United States for decades to come. While these tense secret meetings were taking place in the White House, military preparations were in full swing. Troops were moved to Florida. Defense commanders stationed in the Caribbean and the Atlantic were put on red alert, and 85,000 men and a powerful war machine were mobilized to move on the Caribbean. On October 22nd alone, there were 368 espionage flights over Cuba. At 7 p.m. that day, the most serious crisis to threaten humanity since the Second World War broke out, Kennedy informed the United States and the world that his intelligence services had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. He called the installation a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, unacceptable to the United States. President Kennedy announced that he would impose a naval quarantine on Cuba to block the arrival of new shipments, and he warned that a nuclear attack on the United States from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring a full retaliatory response. Never before had the president so carefully prepared a speech. An hour before the president's speech, Foy Kohler, the United States ambassador to Marco, delivered a letter from Kennedy to the Kremlin addressed to Khrushchev, in which Kennedy accused the Soviet Union of aggression. Along with the letter, Kennedy sent a copy of the speech he would deliver that night. Kennedy did not want to undertake a naval blockade without Latin American support, and an element important both to the opponents and to allies. But if he could not gain such support, he would still forge ahead, since a blockade was a legitimate act of self-defense and served the security of the hemisphere. On October 23rd, he called an urgent consultative meeting of the OAS. The members unanimously approved a resolution authorizing the use of force and the blockade of the island, and they demanded the immediate withdrawal of the missiles. Several countries offered the United States military assistance. Venezuela offered ships Argentina, two destroyers, Honduras and Peru troops, and 6 countries of the Caribbean region, the temporary use of their naval bases. The United States proceeded to blockade Cuba. The Soviet Union objected to the decision by the OAS, arguing that the organization lacked the legal authority to take such action. The United Nations Security Council met in an urgent session on October 23rd to consider the petitions made to the Council President and several communications by the United States, Cuba, and the Soviet Union. The United States was set up to take up the matter of the dangerous threat to world peace and security by the secret placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba on the part of the Soviet Union. Cuba wanted the Council to consider the unilateral act of war by the United States government in ordering the naval blockade of its country, and the Soviet Union demanded that the Security Council deal with the violations of the UN Charter, that the threat to peace on the part of the United States. In an attached declaration, the Soviet Union accused the United States of unleashing a worldwide thermonuclear war. Both the Soviet Union and the United States expressed willingness to hold talks on the situation. The United States presented the Security Council with a draft resolution demanding the immediate dismantling of the missiles and asking that the United Nations send observers to Cuba to verify compliance with the resolution. The Cuban representatives warned that his government would not accept the observers in matters under its internal jurisdiction. The same evening on television and radio, Fidel spoke of the blockade as an act of aggression. He said that Cuba needs to account to no one for the measures it takes in its defense, categorically rejecting the United States' pretensions to inspect Cuban territory and decide what kind of weapons and how many his country may or may not have. The situation was extremely dangerous. Any incident between the United States and naval forces and the Soviet ships could set off a nuclear conflict. On October 24th, the press services reported that 18 Soviet freighters had set out for Cuba, escorted by 8 submarines. Debate continued at the United Nations. National tension eased when television news in the United States showed the Soviet ship turning back toward their own territory. United States Air Force craft kept them under surveillance all the way back to their ports. On October 23rd, Cuba was readying for war. Infantry divisions, anti-aircraft, artillery, and fighter planes were all put on alert, and 400,000 combatants from the 3 branches of the armed forces and popular defense forces were mobilized. Rafael Castro and Che Guevara took political military command in the provinces of Oriente and del Pinar del Rio, and Juan Almeida commanded the forces in Santa Clara. And along with the missiles, 43,000 Soviet troops had arrived in Cuba. On October 25th, the Security Council decided to suspend its meetings while United Nations Secretary General U Thant continued negotiating with the 3 nations involved in the conflict. In comments dated October 24th, U Thant asked Khrushchev to voluntarily suspend the shipment of arms to Cuba for a period of 3 weeks, requested that Kennedy lift the quarantine, and asked Fidel to find solutions to the impasse and suspend the installation of the missiles. U Thant offered to serve as mediator, receiving favorable responses from Kennedy and Khrushchev, and an invitation from Fidel to visit Havana to discuss the situation with him in person. U Thant arrived in Havana on October 30th, returning the next day. He reported that his talks with Fidel had been fruitful and cordial. The Security Council did not meet about the crisis again. Between October 22nd and the beginning of December, Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged more than 20 letters, some published and others kept confidential, in which they accused each other of having set off this explosive crisis. But they also called on each other to exercise prudence. Khrushchev insisted that the weapons he had sent Cuba were strictly defensive, intended to confront American aggression. And in a letter to Kennedy, accused the United States of meddling in the affairs that were the sole concern of Cuba and the Soviet Union. He called the blockade an act of piracy, or if you prefer, the insanity of degenerate capitalism. The insanity of degenerate capitalism. Insanity. Kennedy saw things in terms of hemispheric security and the balance of forces. In letters to Khrushchev, he stated that he would not tolerate any measure that altered the current balance, and signaled that secretly providing Cuba with offensive weapons and the false declarations of the Soviet government were a threat that merited quarantine, which was a minimal response. On October 26th, the situation began to change, starting with a strange conversation in a Washington restaurant, to which a Soviet embassy official invited a correspondent from ABC television. The Soviet official told a reporter that the Soviet Union would agree to dismantle the launching pads and pull out the missiles, allow the United States to supervise the withdrawal, and commit itself to discontinuing the missile shipments if the United States would publicly promise not to invade Cuba. A few hours later, a letter from Khrushchev with the same proposal arrived in the White House. XCOM had not finished digesting the letter when another arrived in which Khrushchev proposed an exchange of missile withdrawals, the missiles in Turkey for those in Cuba. The proposal worried the White House because it seemed that Khrushchev was raising the ante. Kennedy did not want to make a public commitment since the withdrawal of missiles from Turkey and Italy would create problems with NATO. XCOM decided to respond to the first letter without mentioning the proposed exchange. The reply merely accepted the basis for the agreement proposed by Khrushchev, but noted that the installation of missiles must be suspended and the missiles rendered inoperative under the effective United Nations supervisions. The option of an invasion was still on the table. Kennedy asked the State Department to organize a civilian government for the island. In the meantime, the construction of ramps for the missiles continued, and Fidel gave the order to fire at the U-25s that were violating Cuban airspace with low-level flights. One was shot down over eastern Cuba as ordered by a Soviet general. This news caused great consternation in Washington. Fidel feared that the situation would end horribly. He didn't know that Khrushchev had already offered to dismantle the launching pads and pull out the missiles. On the night of October 26, Fidel went to the Soviet embassy to send a letter to Khrushchev. It was translated into Russian by Soviet officials on the spot. He foresaw an imminent attack on his country within the next 24 hours or 72 hours. It might come in the form of an aerial attack aiming for the destruction of certain targets, or an invasion, though he believed the latter less likely, since it would require a large number of forces, the most repulsive sort of aggression, and this necessity might deter the United States. In the case of an invasion, he added, the danger posed to humanity might by such an aggressive policy is so great that the Soviet Union must never allow the imperialists to strike the first nuclear blow. This is the moment to eliminate such danger forever by an act of the most legitimate defense, as difficult and terrible as the solution must be, for there is no other. The letter was delivered at dawn on October 28, Moscow time. Khrushchev was terrified, for he thought Fidel was proposing a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States. Khrushchev continued dousing the bonfire. In a message broadcast on Radio Moscow that day, he said that he trusted Kennedy's statement in which he accepted the condition that he would not invade Cuba and that the United Nations would oversee the dismantling of the missiles. The radio message was met in Washington with feelings of great relief. Kennedy sent 4 officials to New York to ask UTHAN to order inspectors to Cuba immediately, since the Soviets were in agreement. UTHAN could not accede, stating that such an order exceeded his powers. Kennedy responded the same day in a radio message in which he reiterated his demands for immediate United Nations inspection and the dismantling of missiles so he could lift the blockade. The 2 letters ended the most dangerous chapter of the crisis. XCOM decided to pressure the Soviet Union to withdraw its Il-28 bombers from Cuba as well, deeming them offensive weapons. When Fidel learned of the agreements between Kennedy and Khrushchev concerning withdrawals, he wrote to UTHAN repeating that he would not permit unilateral inspection, national or international, on Cuban territory. Fidel subjected Khrushchev to the humiliation of having to allow the inspection of his ships on the high seas by the United States military personnel. On January 7, 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev, in a joint letter, thanked UTHAN for his efforts, while Fidel told him that these negotiations did not lead to an effective agreement guaranteeing a permanent peace in the Caribbean, nor do they relieve the existing tensions. He stated that the United States had not renounced its aggressive and interventionist policies and still maintained a posture of force in violation of international law. The crisis from a distance. In 1987, Harvard University called together high Soviet and American officials who were involved in the October missile crisis to analyze these events, establish their origin, background, development, their lessons, and their consequences. Such conferences continued in Moscow in 1989, in Antigua in 1991, and in Havana in 1992. High Cuban officials participated in the last 2 of these conferences, and Fidel himself took part in the Havana session. Participants from the Kennedy team included former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, former Security Advisor George McMundy, former Presidential Advisor Arthur Schlesinger and Theodore Sorensen, and former Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, as well as high-ranking military officers and advisors. Attendees for the Soviet Union were Chancellor Andrei Gromyko, Anatoly Dobrynin, the former ambassador to Washington 1962 to 1986 during the Cold War, the former ambassador to Havana, Alexander Alexeyev, Nikita Khrushchev's son, Sergei, the son, who also named Sergei, of Anastas Mikoyan, a senior envoy, and top military officers and advisors all participated. In addition to Fidel himself, Jorge Risket, General Fabian Escalante, and Sergio Del Valle, and other high officials joined in the discussion. They drew important conclusions that the world had been on the verge of nuclear war, that Washington and Moscow's evaluation of the situation had not been free from profound perceptual errors throughout the 4 decades of the Cold War. Any small error in calculation or perception, claimed McNamara, might have thrown the world into a state of catastrophe. Sorensen committed that on October 27th, Kennedy had told him, if we are wrong on the occasion, there could be 200 million dead. He believed Kennedy foresaw the possibility of a nuclear war. Another conclusion that this crisis had arisen from the aggressive policies of the United States against Cuba and the Soviet government's conviction that the threat of invasion was real, leading the decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba for its defense and as a means of dissuasion. Sergei Khrushchev stated that ever since the Vienna summit in June 1961, his father was convinced that Kennedy, still reeling with anger over the Bay of Pigs, was determined to overthrow Castro. He communicated this impression to Fidel. Fidel, in turn, believed that the United States' next move would be direct intervention, since Washington could not organize another invasion by mercenaries. He noted that there could be not many people who would be willing to embark on such an adventure. Sergei Khrushchev further commented that in 1961, his father believed that Cuba could not put up greater resistance to the United States-sponsored mercenary invasion then underway. The Soviet leader believed that after the mercenaries landed, the United States would land its own troops. The idea that prevailed in the Soviet Union was that the Cuban Revolution was doomed to failure. We underestimated the weapons Cuba had and the revolution and the Cuban determination to resist. In news of the defeat of the United States adventure was cause for celebration, not only for the Cubans, but also for the Soviets as well. This date marked a change in our relations with Cuba, and it was decided that we can and must send weapons to resist the next United States aggression. In September 1961, Cuba and the Soviet Union signed a military treaty, but it did not mention nuclear arms. This came later, between 1962 and 1963. The Soviet Union provided Cuba with MiG fighter planes, bombers, helicopters, radio and radar transmissions, receivers, transport vehicles, airport equipment, and repair facilities and ammunition for every class of weapons, enough to resist a limited attack. Khrushchev made the decision to place nuclear missiles in Cuba during a visit to Bulgaria in May 1962. He was convinced that only nuclear weapons would prevent intervention by the United States. The great distance separating the two countries did not allow the Soviet Union to defend Cuba with conventional arms that could be used in the case of Czechoslovakia or Poland. On May 19, 1962, an important Soviet delegation led by Sharaf Rashidov in capacity of deputy minister of the Presidium of the Soviet Communist Party's Central Committee and including chief of the Strategic Missile Forces, Sergei Beruzev, Alexander Alexeyev, shortly thereafter named ambassador to Cuba, and other high officials arrived in Cuba. They came under the guise of an agricultural mission using assumed names to discuss with the Cuban leaders the possibility of installing the nuclear missiles on the island. The Cuban leaders studied the proposal, and Fidel did not hesitate to accept it as an elementary duty of solidarity and internationalism to fortify the socialist camp, though he recognized that such a measure was not free of risk from Cuba, since it would convert the island into a strange target. Fidel suggested that the Soviets include the issue of nuclear missiles in their bilateral military treaty and that the manner he dealt with openly, since the treaty was between two sovereign countries and met the standards of international law. He feared that such a large operation would be discovered sooner or later by the United States intelligence and that the United States reaction would be violent. The Soviets replied that they would go public only after the missiles had been installed. They argued that the installation had to be done in secret, otherwise Washington would prevent the maneuver. They would make it public in November during Khrushchev's visit to Cuba. Rafael Castro, minister of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, went to Moscow in May to discuss the military aspects of the operation. The text of the treaty was approved after mutual official visits between Havana and Moscow. It included an introduction written by Fidel listing the political and judicial grounds on which the treaty was based. The document was given the title Cuban-Soviet Mutual Defense Treaty, but because of the crisis, it was never signed. The installation, codenamed Anadir, after a river in Russia, began in early June 1962. By September 30, R-12 missiles and 43,000 troops had arrived in Cuba. It took 76 days to transport the missiles from the Soviet missile center and move them onto their launching sites. This huge military undertaking passed unnoticed by United States intelligence. In October, the final R-12 missiles arrived. The R-14s were stopped by the naval blockade. 100 ships secretly transported the missiles, which were unloaded at night. During these months, the United States intelligence services became aware of unusual movement of Soviet ships and flags of communist nations into Cuban ports. The Cuban population noticed long convoys of large trucks moving without light through the island at night, manned by foreign crews, some in uniform and some in plain clothes. Cuba is long and narrow, measuring 75 miles at its widest point and 28 miles at its narrowest, without forests, and might conceal such an operation. The situation worried the Cuban leaders. Mistakes on the part of the Soviets made it easier for United States spy planes to detect the convoys. If Cuba had controlled the operations, Fidel affirmed, Cuban air defenses would have fired on such planes. Sergei Mikoyan recalled that when his father went to Havana after the October crisis and asked Fidel why he had accepted the missiles, Fidel responded perplexed that he thought the Soviet Union needed to place them. It was an act of assistance to the Soviet Union, which was surrounded by United States missiles aimed at strategic targets. The transaction arose from a misunderstanding, noted Mikoyan, since we thought that we were doing it for the Cubans, and the Cubans thought they were doing it for us. The price of the crisis. Kennedy's determination to force the withdrawal of the missiles at any cost left Khrushchev no choice but to yield. Withdrawal was the only way to prevent a serious conflict. In the international front, the decision carried a high political price for the Soviet Union. Its image was tarnished, and for Khrushchev himself, it was one of the reasons for his political demise. As the missiles began to be withdrawn, the Cuban people chanted, Nikita, Nikita, lo que se da no se quita. Nikita, what you give, you can't take back. In a profound controversy with the Soviet Union, China openly supported Cuba and accused the Soviets of adventurism and capitulation. International reaction to the crisis was ambivalent. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan told Kennedy that Western Europe, accustomed to living under the nuclear gun, wondered what all the fuss was about, but he gave his support to the United States. Hugh Gaitskell, head of the British Labour Party, expressed doubts about the legality of the quarantine. France's President Charles de Gaulle supported Kennedy without heeding that popular demonstrations of solidarity with Cuba or the influential media critics in his nation. The German leaders Konrad Adenauer and Willy Brandt did not flinch or complain. European passives staged massive demonstration to protest the quarantine imposed on Cuba without mentioning or questioning the presence of the missiles. The British philosopher Bertrand Russell publicly expressed his forceful objections. Within a week, you will all be dead to please American madmen. He sent his message to Kennedy, calling his action rash, unjustified, and a threat to the survival of humankind. And in another to Khrushchev, he remarked, your continued forbearance is our great hope. Press reaction was also ambivalent. The New York Times commented that the president's actions constituted the least he could have done. The New York Post maintained that Kennedy should first have consulted the United Nations and the OAS. The Times of London wondered if there were really any missiles in Cuba to begin with, and The Guardian said Khrushchev had given the United States a lesson in the meaning of the United States bases close to the Soviet border. With the most serious post-war crisis resolved, the protagonist of the drama prepared to ease tensions and overcome resentment. Khrushchev openly justified Kennedy's reasons for demanding the removal of the missiles. Not to have believed him would have meant war. Kennedy and Khrushchev installed the hotline between Washington and Moscow to avoid accidents and costly errors. In October 1963, the two superpowers met in Moscow and signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty prohibiting nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. This treaty represented their biggest step toward disarmament to date. Khrushchev's management of the crisis was frustrating, offensive, and humiliating the Cuban leaders since he made the decision to withdraw the missiles without consulting or even informing them. They learned of the decision through the international cables. Fidel argued that Khrushchev should have consulted with Cuba, have negotiated with the United States on the end of the blockade, cessation of all subversive activities, a halt to all piratical attacks against Cuba, respect for Cuba's airspace and territorial waters, and on the return of Guantanamo Bay. He told Khrushchev that none of these matters had been resolved and that the causes that led to the crisis remained intact. Kennedy's promise not to attack Cuba was not enough. Khrushchev explained that the pressure of the situation had left him no time in which to consult with Fidel. Fidel did not accept this explanation. Khrushchev could have demanded a meeting of the Soviets with the Cuban government, and he should have insisted that negotiations be handled by the three parties in question. The Soviet Union wanted to erase current resentments, and as this Mikoyan arrived in Havana to smooth over relations with Fidel, they did not speak about the past, only about the future. Good relations with the Soviet Union were vital to the Cuban Revolution. The communist superpower had been a steady and generous ally. After the crisis, Cuba also wanted to establish cordial relations. Cuba reiterated its gratitude for the assistance the Soviet Union had given it, renewed its expressions of friendships, and reaffirmed the Marxist-Leninist character of the revolution. At the 45th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in Moscow, the Cuban national anthem was played, an unexpected and warm gesture to Cuba, or on so solemn an occasion. Fidel was a hard pill for the Soviet Union to swallow. The Cuban leader was like none of its other allies. Che recounted that when Mikoyan made his first visit to Havana in 1960, he remarked that the Cuban Revolution was a phenomenon Marx did not foresee. Are Kennedy's policies failing? In 1961, Kennedy's policies regarding Cuba were not working. The economic blockade did nothing to weaken the island, and Cuba's relations with the Soviet Union and the Socialist bloc grew closer every day. Operation Mongoose, plotted by the United States to overthrow Fidel, was abandoned after the missile crisis in October 1962. The operation was a costly failure. Kennedy's vigorous defense of democracies and his criticism of dictatorships, which he had been making since his campaign, the international community believed it would be a defense against coups d'etats and dictatorships, also fell apart after an avalanche of military coups was launched against the constitutional governments, and Kennedy ended up recognizing all these new dictators. In 1962 and 1963, Arturo Frondizi of Argentina, Carlos Julio Arizomena in Ecuador, Manuel Prado y Urgesteche in Peru, Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic, and Ramon Villeda Morales in Honduras all fell. It was said that the coup against the corrupt and erratic General Miguel Ydigoras Fuentes of Guatemala was carried out with Washington support. The new Kennedy administration policy regarding the role of Latin American military in their governments caused great alarm on the southern continent, as explained in an article by Undersecretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Edwin Martin, published in the New York Herald Tribune in October 1963. The article argues that the military must be helped to assume a more constructive role in times of peace, to maintain internal security, to work with civilian military programs, and to formulate national policies. He cited military governments that had, in his opinion, realized important social and economic reforms. This policy, contravening constitutional mandates, had assigned the military only the defense of national sovereignty, was one of the most controversial and negative legacies of Kennedy's administration. Participation by the armed forces in matters of internal security and the control of public order with Washington's blessing turned to brutal repression, campaigns of counterinsurgent pacification, and dirty wars against civilian populations. 3 years after Kennedy launched his Alliance for Progress, which the New Frontiersman considered one of his most important foreign policy initiatives and which could have been an important legacy, he saw it beginning to fail. Kennedy admitted in a public speech that he was depressed. The main reasons for the failure of the alliance was the insufficiency or the reluctance of governments to carry out the structural and political changes to which they had committed themselves, and opposition of the powerful economic sectors to such changes, primarily agrarian efforts. Fidel praised the alliance, whose goals were similar to those of the revolution. He called it an intelligent strategy, but hopeless because the oligarchies would not allow the reforms. It also failed because of the protectionist laws passed by the United States Congress, which imposed bilateral aid subjected to all sorts of conditions and dependencies instead of the collective aid agreed upon at Punta del Este. A light is extinguished. A brief long-distance exchange between Kennedy and Fidel took place in November 1963 when Kennedy asked Jean Daniel, a reporter for the Paris Daily and L'Express, to come see him. He knew Daniel was going to Havana to interview Fidel. They talked for half an hour on the subject of Cuba. Daniel understood that the president was sending Fidel a message, for as he was leaving, Kennedy said that they would have a more interesting conversation upon his return from the island. Daniel knew that Kennedy's words about Cuba were unusual for a U.S. president. Kennedy observed that more than any other nation in the world, Cuba had been subjected to economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation, partly as a result of the United States policies regarding Batista's regime. He noted that the United States constructed and enabled Castro's movement without realizing it. I have understood the Cubans and I approved of Castro's proclamation from the Sierra Maestra, and I'll go further, up to a point, Batista and the incarnation of a number of United States errors, and now we have to pay for them. Nevertheless, he harshly criticized the revolution, spoke of Castro's betrayal of the promises he had made in the Sierra Maestra, and accused him of being a Soviet agent in Latin America and bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. On November 19th, after 3 weeks of waiting in Havana in hope of meeting with Fidel, just as Jean Daniel was prepared to fly back to Mexico, Fidel sought him out. Over the next 3 days, the men engaged in a dialogue that lasted some 20 hours. Intrigued by Kennedy's comments on Batista, Fidel asked to hear them again and again. In spite of Kennedy's tenacious harassment and aggression toward Cuba, Fidel admired and respected him. He said that Kennedy had the potential of becoming the greatest United States president, greater even than Lincoln, because he was the first to understand that the coexistence of capitalists and socialists was possible. Since Daniel would be seeing the president again, Fidel asked him to go as an emissary of peace, telling Kennedy that he, Fidel, neither wanted nor expected anything from the president, but he found positive elements in what Daniel had told him. They were together in Verdadero when the news of Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas reached them. Profoundly shocked, Fidel repeated several times, "This is bad news. Everything has changed and will change. The United States occupies such a position in the world that the death of its president affects millions of people everywhere. The Cold War, relations with the Soviet Union, Latin America, Cuba, and the question of the blacks, everything will have to be rethought. This is a serious matter, an extremely serious matter." Turning to Daniel, he added, "Look, this is the end of your peace mission." The deaths of three giants, Kennedy, Khrushchev, and John the 13th, three figures in the 1960s who fueled great changes, burned brightly and disappeared almost simultaneously. In 1963, the Pope and the President died. The following year brought Khrushchev's political death. At a plenary session of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, he was relieved of his position in the party and the government. His downfall was due to accumulated failures and errors, among them his management of the Cuban Missile Crisis and his responsibility in the break with the People's Republic of China in 1960, which shattered the unity of the communist world. As these giants left the world stage, the successor proceeded to slowly to close the doors to change and understanding. Paul VI gradually returned to the church to a more conservative line, although his encyclical Populorum Progressio followed the trail blazed by the Second Vatican Council, recognizing that the progress of the people was the basis for peace. The changes he introduced, however, were only in liturgy and form. When Vice President Lyndon Johnson became president, he abandoned the Alliance for Progress and returned the hard line of interventionism and big stick policies. Leonid Brezhnev introduced the doctrine of limited sovereignty of Soviet Monroe Doctrine, put into effect in 1968 when Soviet tanks and Warsaw Pact troops entered Czechoslovakia to stop a popular liberation uprising, the Prague Spring. Brezhnev called this brutal intervention fraternal aid. 10 years later, 1979, he invaded Afghanistan. Johnson in the White House. Lyndon Johnson took the oath of the new president of the United States on the plane carrying Kennedy's body to Washington, D.C. He assumed Kennedy's mandate with a tacit promise that he would continue the work of the assassinated president, elevated to the status of hero and martyr. Kennedy and Johnson could not have been more different. While both were millionaires, Kennedy was an intellectual and a man of the world, while Johnson was a seasoned politician. His manners, his southern, direct, occasionally crude speech, and his ingenuity made the sophisticated circles of Washington shiver, for they had to become accustomed to the courtly style of the Kennedy clan. But Johnson was by terms deeply respected, feared, and admired as a politician. He was the dominant figure in Congress for 30 years. The country trusted his leadership abilities, necessary in those times of grief and confusion. Aside from the strange reasons that prompted Kennedy to choose this important Texas politician as his running mate in the electoral campaign, many were surprised by this choice, but time showed that this choice could not have been better, for they had been a charismatic and dynamic duo who had complemented each other. Their difference lay not in their politics, but in their priorities. Kennedy's preferred field of action was international, and he showed a particular interest in Latin America. The most brilliant advisors of his New Frontier program were experts on Latin American affairs. Johnson's priority concerned national politics, and he demonstrated little or no interest in Latin America. Kennedy sympathized with Johnson, admired him, and had an attitude of special deference toward him. He knew Johnson as an energetic politician and understood the frustration he must have felt having so little power so high in office. He kept Johnson fully informed about the most delicate matters of his administration, turning him into an international figure by sending him as his representative on official visits around the world. Johnson traveled to more than 30 countries in the 3 years of the Kennedy presidency. Johnson understood and appreciated Kennedy's generosity. The knowledge of the inner workings of the government to which he was made party was fundamental to his ability to maintain continuity during the abrupt transition. The assassination of the president had a tremendous impact on the American people, yet the transition was seamless. Johnson maintained calm, and he dominated the situation with limitless energy and great dignity, wrote the United States journalist Theodore Roosevelt. During the early months of the new frontiersman, we're grateful for his loyalty, the commitments made by his predecessor. Johnson had asked Congress to approve civil rights legislation for which Kennedy had fought so hard as the best tribute to his memory. He spoke of national unity and continuity, succeeding in getting Congress to pass a spate of laws on civil rights, tariff reductions, elections, a health program for the elderly, and improved education. Johnson had his own government program called the Great Society, which summed up the glories of the American dream of power, prosperity, and equality. He wanted an affluent society without poverty or injustice and with liberty for all. Mississippi burning. Kennedy and Johnson dedicated themselves to the issue of civil rights and to opposition to racial discrimination more than any other presidents, but during their respective administration, the nation endured the greatest racial violence in history. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south, and legal remedies are not at hand, remarked Kennedy shortly before he was assassinated. In several states, including Mississippi, Alabama, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Massachusetts, blacks marched for civil rights, protesting against school segregation and police brutality. Students held peaceful marches and demonstrations, uprising and violent protests in support of black movements in university campuses in such cities as Boston and Chicago. In New York, some 400,000 students marched in solidarity with the struggle for civil rights. In the face of all this violence and hatred, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. led a pacifist movement that sought recognition of black rights and equality in an emphatically nonviolent fashion. His message was one of peace. In 1963, Time magazine named him Man of the Year. In 1964, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Deep South, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mississippi, saw the most brutal police violence against black people in the whole country. In 1964, three human rights activists, two white and one black, were murdered in Mississippi at the hands of Ku Klux Klansmen, among them the chief of the state police, who is well known for other atrocious racist acts. This horrendous crime was portrayed in Alan Parker's moving film Mississippi Burning 1989, which was nominated for 7 Oscars. In the year 1965 was particularly violent. In Selma, Alabama, King was arrested along with 2,000 peaceful demonstrators. In New York, the charismatic black Muslim leader Malcolm X was assassinated. In Watts, Los Angeles, a 6-day riot, the first racially fueled rebellion of its kind, left 34 black people dead, 1,000 wounded, and more than 4,000 arrested. Fires caused several $1 million worth of damage. The assassination of Malcolm X shook up the black movements and alarmed many. His message exalted and promoted black pride and black separatism. His denunciation of the atrocities of white people perpetrated against his race frightened the country. The New York Police Department thought he had too much power, that the black movement followed him to a man. Many feared that Malcolm X was killed by the police and that this would provoke more riots. However, it was soon learned that his former mentor, Elijah Muhammad, orders his assassination because he felt Malcolm had betrayed the Nation of Islam. The former youth activist Tom Gitlin wrote, Malcolm had been left unprotected by the police, so we could fail to wonder whether there was a government claw in his death. Malcolm became a martyr and a hero like Che Guevara in the New Left and the youth movement. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, the culmination of many years of Reverend King's struggle and his greatest triumph. On March 25th, as King led a 50-mile march through Alabama from Selma to Montgomery, where 25,000 demonstrators gathered to celebrate his victory. Selma was renowned for its violent opposition to civil rights for blacks because the state's Republican governor, George Wallace, and the town sheriff, Jim Clark, were racists. They accused blacks of being communists and of waging guerrilla warfare in the streets. Racial tensions ran deep. 2 years later, in 1967, violent black riots broke out in Detroit, Harlem, and New York City, Rochester, New York, and Birmingham, Alabama. King's assassination in 1965 in Memphis, Tennessee, brought much horror and grief both to blacks and to whites who respected his nonviolent approach to achieving civil rights. They feared that the nonviolence he had preached would be buried with him. The big stick once again. Latin America was of no interest to Johnson. Border Texan that he was, he envisioned a continent of miserable people, wetbacks entering the country illegally and staying in Texas in search of work and better luck. Shortly after coming to the presidency, he commented bitterly to a group of reporters that these Latin Americans, barefoot and hungry, would take everything until someone stopped them. Johnson disagreed with Kennedy's policies regarding Latin America, but he held his tongue during White House discussions. As president, he made it clear that he would tolerate neither new Cubas nor communist activities to the continent. He returned to the support for military coups to prevent the communizing or Cubanizing of other nations, brandishing the big stick like some of his predecessors. In 1964, he recognized General René Barrientos, who had overthrown Bolivia's constitutionally elected president, Victor Paz Estensoro. Johnson openly supported the military coup in Brazil against João Goulart, another constitutionally elected president. The CIA, the United States ambassador, the Johnson's military attaché, Colonel Vernon Walters, conspired with the Brazilian military officers to effect the change. Johnson also sent a naval squadron that was prepared to intervene. Walters, a member of the Army Intelligence, was later named Assistant Director of the CIA, was a friend of Marshal Humberto Castelo Branco, the leader of the coup. They had met 20 years earlier at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where Walters was Castelo Branco's military instructor. Castelo Branco installed a brutal neo-fascist dictatorship, the first of the quote-unquote national security doctrine, and maintained very close relations with Washington. By the end of his term, more than 25,000 people had been assassinated or disappeared. Johnson's first international crisis occurred in Panama in January 1964, when American students, in violation of the agreement between John F. Kennedy and Robert Chiari of 1963, raised only the United States flag in their secondary school. The agreement dictated that, in recognition of Panamanian sovereignty, the flags of both nations were to fly side by side over public buildings in the zone. Panamanian students responded to the provocation by raising their own flag, but the gringo students tore it down. The dispute, which began with stones and Molotov cocktails, quickly escalated into a pitched three-day battle with United States troops firing at the demonstrators. 24 Panamanians and 3 American soldiers died. More than 300 were wounded and hundreds were arrested. American businesses were torched and the United States embassy was stoned. The crisis continued with diplomatic confrontations in the United Nations and the OAS. Panama broke off relations with the United States. The Panamanian government complained of the United States Armed Forces. The Panamanian government complained to the United Nations Security Council, claiming that the aggressive behavior of the United States Armed Forces stationed in the Canal Zone against Panamanian citizens constituted a threat to world peace. Panama also requested a meeting of the consultative organ of the OAS under the Rio Treaty. Such a request, which was invoked only in cases of military aggression against one of its members, had never before been invoked against the United States. The United States ambassador denied the charges, claiming that his country respected the precepts of international law and complied with the obligation to guarantee the security of the free world and to defend the canal. Latin America rallied behind Panama. Chile was the sole abstention. The United States ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, expressed his government's deep concerns and reported that President Johnson had called on President Chiari to take steps to stem the violence. The Security Council tabled the debate on Panama's complaint, and the impasse was resolved in direct negotiations. Chiari proposed complete renegotiation of the canal treaties, and Johnson agreed to discuss the revision, but he refused to negotiate. When Johnson finally did agree to negotiate with the new Panamanian president, Marco Aurelio Robles, he announced that the United States would build a new canal elsewhere and would return the canal to Panama when the new one was finished. United States citizens found this violent incident in Panama to be an embarrassment. They criticized Johnson for his management of the situation. Robert Kennedy called it clumsy. Johnson's second major crisis occurred in April 1965 when he invaded the Dominican Republic. Rebel forces that favored the defeated President Juan Bosch attempted a coup against the military junta to reinstall him. Johnson saw this movement as the beginning of a revolution. He sent 400 Marines to save endangered American lives and followed almost immediately with 40,000 infantry soldiers to occupy the country. Johnson claimed the deployment of troops had been necessary to stop an attempted revolution led by the communists. The United States ambassador Tapley Bennett had sent a historical communique to the State Department alleging that the lives of the United States citizens were in danger and requesting that the troops be sent to ensure their evacuation. On May 3rd, Johnson read Bennett's massive missive to the nation and his address to the people. Johnson requested in this address to the on May 3rd, Johnson read Bennett's missive to the nation. In this address to the people, Johnson requested the immediate deployment of troops to prevent the risk of American blood running in the streets. In a press conference on June 17th, Johnson described horrific bloody scenes that had taken place before the deployment. He claimed that before any troops had been deployed, 1,500 innocent people had been murdered and decapitated, and 6 Latin American embassies have been set on fire. United States journalists who were covering the conflict, however, witnessed a different picture. No embassies were in flames, no decapitation had occurred, and no United States citizens were dead and wounded, indicating Johnson's fabrications. Johnson was strongly criticized throughout Latin America and at the United Nations and the OAS for his new violation of the principle of non-intervention of international law of the United Nations and the OAS charters, and for his return to the big stick policy. The United Nations Security Council and the OAS demanded the immediate withdrawal of the troops. At the 10th consultative meeting of the OAS in Washington,
Called to deal with this crisis, the United States won the necessary majority to recast its intervention as a collective action and created an inter-American peacekeeping force. Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Mexico, Uruguay, and Peru voted against that resolution, and Venezuela abstained. In May, the contributions of Latin American countries to the peacekeeping forces began to arrive in Santo Domingo. The majority were Central American soldiers. Johnson was frustrated and annoyed by such scant support on the part of the Latins. Stevenson did not succeed in preventing the Security Council from dealing with the Dominican crisis. It dedicated 28 meetings to it, nor could he avoid the Secretary General's intervention. He appointed Venezuelan Jose Mayobre as his representative to go to Santo Domingo and report on the situation. Mayobre severely criticized the military intervention and the activities of the occupying United States troops. With imperial arrogance, Johnson kept his troops and special advisors in place and intervened in the country's affairs at his whim, including placing former President Joaquin Balaguer once again in the presidency, living in exile in New York. Balaguer had served as the advisor to Johnson during the invasion. The invasion was nothing short of a scandal. Alberto Lleras, the former president of Colombia and one of the mainstays of United States policy regarding Latin America, was afraid that the United States' new act of aggression would turn the Cold War into a hot one. President Raul Leone of Venezuela sent Johnson a message condemning the invasion as a violation of the principles of non-intervention. The Peruvian chancellor maintained that it was the most severe blow of the past few years to the inter-American system of laws. The New York Times called the presence of the Marines in Santo Domingo unjustifiable. Robert Kennedy thought it was just plain scandalous. Though both citizens and outsiders condemned the invasion, public opinion polls indicated that the immense majority in the United States supported their president, satisfied with the way in which he crushed the new upsurge in revolutionary activity. In Messianic and interventionist fever gripped the majority in the United States Congress. In September 1965, by vote of 112 to 54, the House of Representatives approved a resolution authorizing the government to intervene in the affairs of other nations, including armed intervention, where there was a risk of communist subversion, thus legitimizing the Johnson Doctrine. Fear of the United States' imperialist arrogance and its crusaders in Congress was forcefully expressed by governments, media, Congresses, politicians, parties, and intellectuals throughout Latin America. They saw a new threat of intervention at their doorstep, but the Johnson Doctrine aroused enormous enthusiasm in the dictatorships of the Southern Goan and the high military commands of Latin America. These considered the moment a propitious one to coordinate their policies against communist penetration in their countries and in Latin America. When Johnson appointed Thomas Mann to be Assistant Secretary of State for the Inter-American Affairs and Special Advisors, supporters of the New Frontier feared for the future of an alliance for progress. Mann, a Texan who had previously served as ambassador to Mexico, was a reactionary free trade fanatic, favorably disposed toward any anti-communist government. The new frontiersmen were sure he would abandon the alliance's goal of social and economic reforms. In effect, Mann directed it toward economic development and the traditional protection of investors. He opted for selective and concentrated aid to the most stable countries and the most rational structures, ignoring the most underdeveloped ones, though the alliance recommended these for help. At the Conference of American Presidents at Punta del Este, Uruguay, in which Johnson participated, many concluded that the alliance was retreating from its agreed objectives. For former Dominican President Juan Bosch, the vitality and spirit with which Kennedy had imbued it died with him in Texas. Robert Kennedy traveled through Latin America in 1965 to observe the results of the alliance. I saw much progress and much retrogression as well. He singled out the military coups, the stagnating economies, unchecked population growth, and the tiny islands of enormous privilege in the midst of awful poverty. These and the smarting wounds caused by the United States intervention in the Dominican Republic pose serious threat to the alliance's bold hope. Carlos Santos de Santa Maria, president of the Inter-American Committee for Alliance for Progress, maintained that Johnson took favorable measures concerning Latin America. He supported the proposal of converting the Inter-American Development Bank into a great financial institution. He asked Congress to augment substantially the resources for aid to the region, and he sought to improve conditions of credit for development and to eliminate commercial barriers. He also supported programs for education, health, and agriculture. If Johnson's policies failed, it was for lack of support from Congress, not from him, Santa Maria commented. What's happening in Cuba? The Cuban problem was not a priority for Johnson. He could not intervene because Kennedy had promised Khrushchev that the United States would not invade Cuba. Nevertheless, he ordered a review of Kennedy's policies to determine their effectiveness. While he did not change the policies, he maintained Cuba's isolation. He intensified the embargo and increased pressure on allies and friendly countries to join it, and he continued to send spy planes over the island. He did not share the Kennedy's animosity toward Fidel, and he claimed to know nothing of the CIA's plans to assassinate him. Nevertheless, Leon Janos, a Johnson advisor, recounted the president's comment to him. "We've been running a damn branch of Murder Incorporated in the Caribbean." Cuba's Minister of the Interior, Ramiro Valdez, told the former New York Times correspondent Tad Salk of about 30 attempts on Fidel's life in 1964 and 1965 during Johnson's administration. Needless to say, Fidel lost all hope of improving relations with the United States after the violent incident in Panama and the invasion of Dominican Republic. Johnson's political future ran aground with the Vietnam War, his greatest obsession. It was the highest priority of its foreign policy. It was an unpopular war, the longest in the United States history, and it damaged the country's image among allies, friends, and enemies, and was profoundly offensive to many North Americans. Besides which, it was clear that the United States was losing the war. The future of the distant Asian country was of no importance to public opinion. Instead, people were appalled by the great loss of human lives for the cause that few accepted and many failed to understand. "How many kids have you killed today?" anti-war protesters yelled at Johnson, who sent 500,000 soldiers to Vietnam. The price to the United States were tens of thousands dead, thousands crippled, and many millions of dollars. The United States dropped more explosives on Vietnamese territory than the entire tonnage dropped on all fronts in the Second World War. Johnson's obsession was not to lose Vietnam, not to be president who let go of Asia, and as Roosevelt and Truman had lost China. Worn out by the military failures, by the great number of people sacrificed to the war effort, by the massive anti-war protests, both at home and abroad, Johnson announced a peace offensive in December 1965. Hanoi did not respond. He renewed the bombing with greater intensity, hoping to force the Vietnamese to negotiate. He suspended it in 1968 to continue the Paris talks, but these went nowhere. In the larger cities and on university campuses, the demonstrations against the war and military recruitment and the process for civil rights, more than 100 between 1964 and 1967, were an expression of the general and growing national discontent with Johnson's policies and of his administration's shrinking prestige. He was no longer the popular figure elected in 1964 with 61% of the vote, 16 million more votes than his Republican rival Barry Goldwater. According to the Gallup polls that year, he had 70% approval rating. 4 years later, his rating was at 36%, the lowest since Harry Truman. Johnson undermined his own image and destroyed his credibility. His exuberant personality and limitless imagination led him to commit grave errors in relation to the public and the press. His clumsy handling of information about matters of the utmost importance to the nation, such as the war in Vietnam, was evident. He presented facts as he wished them to be, often misleading the country. People said that the only way you knew he was not lying was when his lips were shut. In March 1968, he announced that he would not seek re-election. He knew very well, as did the whole country, that he would lose badly. The party's over. For the United States, the 1960s ended with the beginning of Richard Nixon's presidency. His administration was successful in the international field, the tempering of tension with the Soviet Union, the opening of relations with the People's Republic of China, and the end of the United States intervention in Vietnam. Convinced that this war could not be won, he pulled troops out. Another important event was the moon landing by 4 United States astronauts. Under Nixon, the country was also experienced one of the greatest traumatic incidents in its history, the Watergate scandal. Nixon administration came to an abrupt end with his forced resignation and a small group of his advisors sent to jail. The Watergate events were seen as the most unscrupulous abuse of power by any United States president. In relation to Latin America, the first year of his term, Nixon ordered the CIA to increase its operations in Cuba. Nevertheless, tensions with that country decreased. A month after his inauguration, Nixon sent a commission of inquiry led by Nelson Rockefeller to take the pulse of an explosive situation in Latin America. 14 nations, the majority, were under military dictatorship, and the dirty war was on the march. When Nixon arrived at the White House, most of the armed rebel groups in the Andean countries had disappeared. The strongest, the Tupamaros in Uruguay and the Montoneros in the People's Revolutionary Army in Argentina, were still quite active. The same year, Nixon started to keep an eye in Chile, determined to prevent Salvador Allende, the socialist candidate, from being elected to the presidency. Later on, he started to interfere. So that's it. That's chapter 3, the turbulent 1960s. It's 2 hours and 8 minutes, a long chapter. We're going to make some comments here. So basically, we started with Kennedy's campaign. We can see Kennedy was an abysmal failure of a president. He was an abysmal failure. He did, horrible things. He did, terrible things. His, handling of his first handling of Cuban Revolution with the Bay of Pigs was an absolute failure. It was a fiasco. The Bay of Figs, we call it a fiasco. He basically, took Cuban revolutionaries and in a clumsy way attacked Cuba, set the United States up for, basically, being mocked at on the world stage. He was, basically a failure. He was a failed president. His policies towards Latin America reflected, a murderous butcher type approach, the standard thing the United States does. They, direct their anger and frustrations against the people of Latin America and the masses, and they don't see anything about, the people's progress, the social progress, the reforms, the socialism. He criticized the Cuban Revolution. It was, completely, just a absolute, misery. The U.S. government and John F. Kennedy were miserable in their handling the Cuban Revolution. Fidel was, beating him on all fronts. Basically, we then went to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy, in a vicious way, tried to, attack and naval blockade Cuba. This was, amounting to piracy. Fidel very clearly stated that you are a pirate, man. You are a pirate. You are a racist terrorist, white of Washington. You are a pirate. You are a racist terrorist of the United States, and you do not have any, business, navally blockading us. He also sent troops. He also sent, aircraft reconnaissance planes to espionage over Cuba. All acts of aggression against Cuba by the United States government. Standard thing, we flout international law at any notice because we're, racist terrorists of the American government. So that was Kennedy's policies. Basically we said, basically Kennedy's policies are failing. We went through all of Kennedy's, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a failure both for Khrushchev and for Kennedy. Kennedy, came out of it with some relief because, the Soviet Union was forced to withdraw their weapons. But as Fidel stated, this was a poor, example, a poor communication. The U.S. government, was unjustified in asking, Cuba to have its missiles removed. They should have been left there so that the United States could be aware that there were missiles that should be, allowed to be installed on their borders to keep them in check. I mean, the U.S. is a rogue state. It is a group of terrorist whites that go around and imperialize. And when there are missiles sitting at their border, they need to be able to sit calmly and accept the world's, opinion in this case that you are, an imperialist aggressor. You are a terrorist colonialist of, the world. And then we went to, President Johnson. President Johnson, another American failure. President Johnson, we talked about his failure, his, total failure, his, his actions, his invasion of the Dominica against international law, condemned by all international bodies. The United Nations, demanded troops be removed from Dominican. He basically removed, he basically annulled the United Nations statement by his colonial ministry. The colonial ministry, what we call the Organization of American States, the colonial ministry of the United States, removed, voted in favor all the military dictatorships, the butchers of Washington, the fascist butchers of the United States, voted in favor of United States peacekeeping mission to Dominica and called it a peacekeeping force. That was a brutal repressive regime by Washington installed for capitalist interests and rape and pillage of the Dominican land. The standard thing, the racist terrorists of the U.S. government, they, basically removed any kind of, world opinion and replaced it with, a puppet, pretend sort of democracy in which they have military fascist dictators making, votes for, making a scrap of paper to justify legally their, illegal actions. That's basically it. Converting a illegal action into, complex legalities by scraps of paper that are worthless garbage that belong in the trash bin. So in addition, we found that, the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Congress was, basically, the arrogance, the U.S. imperialist arrogance and its crusaders in Congress were forcibly expressed by governments, media, Congress, politicians, and intellectuals throughout Latin America. They saw the United States president's imperialist arrogance and the Congress, the crusaders in its Congress as, crusaders and, just basically dictators and imperialist, arrogant, butchers in Latin America, terrorist American imperialists in Latin America. So, and then Johnson, we finished up with Johnson. The big things with Johnson were his Dominican invasion. His Dominican was a big stick invasion. We talked about his, his starting and his, stand against Cuba was pretty much like a standard stand. He wasn't really that much of a, intervener, but he did try to assassinate Fidel, 25 times. They said that, 30 attempts on Fidel's life during the Johnson administration in 1964 and 1965 alone. This guy was an obsessed, criminally insane butcher. He was an obsessively compulsive, murderous butcher of the United States. We saw that his greatest obsession became the Vietnam War. He became, obsessed with the war, slaughter, obsessed with Asian slaughter and slaughtering the people in, Vietnam. And he, increased the offensive. He was, at the end of his term, he was the most unpopular leader of the United States, which the U.S. government does not admit. They do not put out any information about their leaders. Everything in America is, basically covered up because they think that all their presidents are, great leaders. They're all terrible presidents. They're all terrible. All U.S. presidents are terrible presidents. They're racist terrorists of the United States government. And all of the ones we have studied are terrible, racist. And so finally, we finished with Johnson's credibility. His credibility was poor. He was a liar. He never told the truth. The standard stuff, the New York Times and its, media covered up, in all situations, the U.S. imperialist ambitions. They called the Dominican ambition something to be, reckoned with and, important for U.S. hegemony. So, basically that's it. We ended with Nixon. Nixon, of course, he was a flagrant violator of international law. He flouted international law in Allende, against Allende in Chile, and made major different dictatorships in the world, mostly in Latin America. He enforced dictatorial regimes all over Latin America. So, a great summary. Fidel, a great leader, a great icon for, the revolution and a great icon for social progress. Cuba remaining an important part of the world history. Cuba remaining an important part that should not be discarded despite U.S. aggression and racist terrorism by the United States government. So again, Masters of War, Latin America, and U.S. aggression. from the Cuban Revolution through the Clinton years. Claire Nieto, a Colombian scholar, a great book and a great read, a great thing to listen to. So we're going to finish again, like we said. Please download the description section, download the book from the description section. It's in the Google Drive link. We now turn to chapters 1 and 2, mare nostrum, mare colostrum. And, the second chapter was some come, some go. We are discussing the terrorist, white murderous butcher Franklin Roosevelt, whom yesterday during my presentation I inadvertently named him wrong as Theodore, but it is Franklin Roosevelt, the 1933 to 1944 president who presided over Latin America during these years. He was, of course, a brutal racist. He was chastised for his pro-capitalist, racist policies of enslavement of the Latin American people and was involved in promoting Rafael Trujillo, the butcher of the Dominican Republic. Roosevelt endorsed this mass murder as friends with America. Roosevelt's policies were labeled by Mexican writer Jesus Herzog as just a modification of verbiage of Theodore Roosevelt's big stick policy and was called the open door or good neighbor policy. A large segment we discussed was Fidel Castro. America, as a group of white enslaving butchers, waged a brutal assassination campaign against Fidel and murdered hundreds of panamians in an attempt on his life in which Fidel escaped unscathed. They also waged biological warfare against Cuba and spread disease as in Cuba to destroy the Cuban people's will to live. The racist whites of America also used chemical weapons against Cuba in a vicious campaign of terror, including napalm and other poisons. They tried murdering Fidel Castro through poisoning. Fidel was an excellent promoter of health and wellness of the Cuban people and was uniformly loved in Latin America. No Latin American country would part with Fidel's popularity, and major revolts were seen in countries which were becoming too friendly with the United States. Unlike Dwight Eisenhower, who was hated in Latin America and was stoned and spit at in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and was not even received by the Japanese prime minister when he was needing to visit due to violent popular demonstrations against his visit, Fidel was uniformly loved in the world. Washington forced its popularity through bribery and murder. The jealous, delusional whites of Washington became angry at the Cuban people and Castro for their lack of international popularity and conducted a murderous war to subdue this jealousy. Direct military bombing with napalm was carried out as chemical warfare, and biological warfare was carried out as discussed above. Castro's marked improvement of the economic situation of Cuba, including making the sugar plantations nationalized and the textiles and oil be controlled by their own government. U.S. government mafia thugs with nuclear weapons always try to steal oil for the capitalist frauds of America. Fidel was an enormous success for Cuba and was uniformly loved in the world, despite Washington's brutal and murderous campaign of thuggery against him and his people. Nelson Mandela adored him, and all African states were endeared to him. As usual, the U.S. media frauds of the New York Times and Washington Post did deceitful anti-Cuban propaganda to paint the Cuban government as exporting revolution and became their paranoid, delusional whites in their attempt to murder Fidel. We can see Washington's history of mass murder in Latin America, its racist campaign against popular leaders for enslavement of the third world people, and their remarkable deception in what happened and what they did and continue to do against Latin America to maintain a state of subjugation of its fascist client murderous state. So again, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank. Please join me tomorrow for another chapter or maybe a little more of Masters of War, U.S. aggression, Latin America and United States aggression. Glad you could join us today. Have a great day.